Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you something about progress testing in medical education. And I hope that my Donglish, now interspersed with some Australian twang, is comprehensible. I'll try my best. Progress testing is actually not quite new. It's been invented at Maastricht Medical School and Kansas City Medical School in Missouri in 1976. So it's roughly 40 years old. When it was developed in Maastricht, you have to remember that in that time Maastricht had the first problem-based learning system in Europe after McMaster in Canada. And of course, it was regarded as an educational fad and something new, and it couldn't work. So we had to come up with a very rigorous assessment system to demonstrate that our graduates were certainly of sufficient quality to be let loose on the patients. Also, unlike, for example, Canada, we did not have any types of national examinations, national graduation examinations. But probably the most important thing was that in problem-based learning, one of the central elements is the self-regulated learning and self-directed learning of the students. And part of it is that students do formulate their own learning goals based on how they deal with cases. And initially, the educational modules were basically tested with end of module multiple choice type tests, and students, instead of formulating their own learning goals, started to try increasingly to find out what would be on the test and then strategically revise for the test. And that was actually completely contrary to what we wanted to achieve in problem-based learning. So we wanted to positively influence student behavior, or at least not get in the way of student behavior, not stifle self-directed learning. Also, if you want your students to take self-responsibility for their learning, you have to ensure that they've got all the information they need in order to really steer their own learning behavior. So it was very important to set up an assessment system that would enable rich feedback about their development in knowledge in this case. Again, coming back to an educational system that had to prove itself, of course, we had to ensure that all the psychometrics were okay. So we had to come up with a sort of testing that would be of convincing reliability and validity, and would allow for sufficient flexibility in the rest of the assessment program to try out the more softer skills. This is a very old view on what constitutes medical competence, but at that time it was thought that you could actually sort of dissect medical competence into 4 domains: knowledge, skills, problem solving, and attitudes. And even more erroneously, it was thought that a good assessment program was based on having the perfect assessment instrument for knowledge, the perfect for skills, for problem solving, and attitudes. And we now know that things don't work that way, but still, I mean, the whole discussions are open-ended questions better than multiple choice questions is based on the remnants of this type of thinking. So we had to select one of the elements, and it was clearly focused on factual knowledge attuned to graduate level, but knowledge which was relevant for the medical practitioner and which was functional. It was actually preceding the research from the early 80s, which demonstrates quite convincingly that despite the seeing clinical reasoning or problem solving as a generic ability, as a sort of holy grail, general problem-solving skills do not exist, and factual knowledge and well-organized factual knowledge is actually the most important prerequisite for successful problem-solving. Because it was attuned to graduate level, the sampling, the blueprinting of the test was not based on any part of the curriculum. It was based on prevalence and incidence of diseases and signs and symptoms in the random population, and therefore the sample is based on disease categories or organ tracts rather than based on the curriculum. So the test is held 4 times a year, independently of the curriculum, 4 times per year at fixed points. There is one in September at the start of the academic year, 3 months later in December, 3 months later in March, and the final one of the academic year is in June. But the odd thing is that all students of all 6 year classes sit the same test simultaneously. And of course, sorry, I'll come back to that later. The test consists of 200 multiple choice questions, but there is no prescribed number of options, as we allow the authors to choose or to incorporate as many options as they can realistically come up with. For example, there is a drug, propranolol, which has an influence on the blood pressure, and the influence can either be the blood pressure goes up, it goes down, or it stays the same. And if you prescribe that they have to come up with 4 options, they will come up with a nonsensical option which is discarded by the students anyway, and we see that as a bit of a waste of time. The scoring, and this is a consequence of the fact that all students of all 6 year classes sit the same test. The scoring is a so-called formula scoring, which means that basically you get 1 point for a correct answer, and you get a fraction of a point subtracted if you answer the question incorrectly, but you are allowed to leave the question open or fill in a question mark, which in that case gives you 0 points. So students have to consider very well whether they are certain enough about the answer to try to answer the item or not. Because it's very difficult to predefine what the difficulty of items is, and it would be very time consuming to use any kinds of absolute referencing method, we chose to use a norm reference standards per year group. So actually the students serve as their own comparison, and I'll explain the norm referencing a bit later. But instead of giving marks or percentage scores, we convert the scores based on these norm referencing into qualifications. And I'm now telling you the original scenario, and in that scenario we would use 3 types of qualifications: satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or doubtful. And at the end of the year, after 4 tests, the combination of those qualifications determined whether you would pass your year or not. Let me explain the norm reference scoring system. The assumption, and this holds for the Netherlands, where entry into medical school was certainly at that time based on a weighted lottery system. We had a nationalized matriculation exam. There were some prescribed disciplines that you, or A-levels that you really needed to have in order to be allowed into medical school. So we could safely assume that the average student was motivated and intelligent enough to become a doctor. So we assumed that anyone scoring on the mean or above the mean would be satisfactory. And everybody scoring 1 standard deviation, or in that case, in its original case, it was 1.96 standard errors of measurement, below the mean, is therefore unsatisfactory with the famous p lesser or equal to 0.05 from a measurement perspective. So minus half a standard deviation below the mean and above is satisfactory, and minus 1 standard deviation below the mean is unsatisfactory. And everybody in between was doubtful. And doubtful, in this case, didn't mean that the student wasn't good enough. It basically meant that the test was not accurate enough to make a sufficiently certain decision whether you're a pass or a fail. Then this, you probably can't read it. The print is too fine, but it's Dutch anyway. This is the type of feedback that students got. It's actually all the categories: respiratory system, hematological system, musculoskeletal, and so on and so forth. Then the student would see the percentage of questions in that particular category that he or she answered correctly, the questions that he or she answered incorrectly, the question marks, and the correct minus incorrect. And then here were the year class results. So the student could basically got a sort of x-ray and could actually compare it, when they've done well, what their strengths and weaknesses were as compared to their year class results. Actually, there was a second way of tagging items which was based on the disciplines like anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and what have you, which would be on the second page printed with the same type of data. So students could also look at their strengths and weaknesses in those domains like anatomy and physiology and internal medicine, and etc. Down below is what the norm for the test is, what the percentage correct minus incorrect score is, and whether the result is, in this case, voldoende, which means satisfactory, or doubtful or unsatisfactory. Now we had to come up with a way of dealing or combining satisfactory, doubtful, and unsatisfactory, which basically are ordinal data, so you can't really average them. And the assumption is there were two assumptions underlying the way we combined them. First of all, that the most recent test, sorry, to the left you see satisfactory, doubtful, unsatisfactory. That would be your first score. On the second test, you could again score satisfactory, doubtful, unsatisfactory. And now this has to be combined. And of course, satisfactory plus satisfactory leads to a sort of actual score of satisfactory, an intermediate score, or the current score of satisfactory. And down below, unsatisfactory plus unsatisfactory, of course, adds up to unsatisfactory. And doubtful and doubtful to undoubtful. But what you might see is that, for example, the combination of satisfactory and unsatisfactory leads to the combination, or to the actual score of doubtful. And the reason for this is that the most recent measurement is more important in predicting future performance than the earlier measurements. So it carries a slightly more weight. Of course, if you combine this, you see that actually there are only three combined outcomes: satisfactory, doubtful, and unsatisfactory, which again could be combined with the qualification on the third test, again to add up to satisfactory, doubtful, or unsatisfactory, which then could be combined with the fourth test. There are two principles in this. Like I said, the most recent measurement carries the larger weight, and the second one is that one single good results can't save a bad year, or one single bad results can't destroy a good year. It's basically the same principle as what you do if you follow a child, the growth curves of a child. This one starts perhaps slightly over the P25, so maybe underperforming or under the average, but there is extra growth, and therefore the child eventually gets over the P50 and is okay. And you see that the most recent measurements are more important than the earlier ones. And this, of course, would be a child at risk. And if this were progress test data, this would be a student at risk. And therefore, seeing the decline of the growth is a red flag for the faculty to intervene and help the student. There is a very strong local quality control, and it's represented here in this simple flow chart. On top you see the departments who all produce questions at any given time when they encounter things that they want to ask a question about, from their lectures, from their practicals, from the PBLs, what have you. And these questions are stored in a sort of item pool. And 3 months prior to a test, they're fed through a local review committee. And the local review committee checks, really, it scrutinizes the items for content, for wording, and for relevance. And then the test is administered. And afterwards, students are allowed to take home the test booklets They receive an answer key, so a list of the correct answers. They receive a list of literature references for each question where they can actually look it up if they answered the question incorrectly, and a list of responsible departments. And the students are then explicitly invited or almost challenged to criticize questions, because we think we've done a perfect job as a local review committee. So we actually challenge our students, criticize questions. And they can criticize, but anytime that they want to demonstrate, for example, that the answer key is incorrect or that another option is actually equally acceptable, they have to prove that with scientific sources. So they cannot just come with an opinion. They actually have to provide scientific support for their statement. And this is all fed back to a local review committee, to the review committee, and items can be withdrawn or answer keys can be changed based on the students' comments in conjunction with a standard item analysis, like the proportion of students answering an item correctly, or whether the answer is predominantly answered correctly by the higher achieving students or by the lower achieving students. The little box with the joint review committee was added on later when a collaboration between 5 medical schools started, and the whole progress test became a joint production and joint administration for, in this case, more than 10,000 students 4 times a year. I'll quickly touch on that development later on. The items then, after this whole review process, are stored in an item bank and can be used after 3 or 4 years and are fed back through the review committee before they're put on a test again. The question is, does the concept work? And that was, of course, a major question in the early days. So what you see here is basically the actual growth curves of groups of students. So every color represents the longitudinal data of a specific group of students. And the red line was a group of reference students who graduated from other medical schools, who set the test for a certain fee. And just to compare whether our students eventually would attain the same level of knowledge as students who graduated at one of these 7 other medical schools. What's striking is, I think, that first of all, they continuously or systematically attained the same level as the reference group. So, and it was quite an expensive exercise. So we discontinued that in the year 84 or 85. What may also be visible is that even if there are dips in the progress of a single cohort, like, for example, the blue one that starts on 30%, you see that the same dip occurs in all the lines. And it's indicative of something that we've found over and over again, also looking at the data differently and also comparing between medical schools, is tests differ in difficulty and student cohorts do not differ in average level of competence, which was important for us since we use a norm reference scoring. It's good to know that student groups of 200 and nowadays 380 students are much more stable and much more alike than 2 subsequent tests. Tests differ in difficulty. It's very difficult to control the difficulty, and big group of students are simply, there are no good groups or bad groups. What you see here, and please let me remind you that on the y-axis it's the correct minus incorrect score and not the percentage correct. Every hash here represents the mean score of a certain year group of students on that particular test. And these are the data of 10 academic years. So every hash is a year group, and there are 10 hashes per measurement moment. The measurement moments basically represent the 24 subsequent tests that every student sits in the course of 6 years. So there's the December test of year 1, the September test of year 1, the December test of year 1 would be measurement number 2. the June test of year 1 is 4, etc. And the final test in year 6 is there for measurement 24. What you see is there is a continual growth of performance. And again, you might think 40% is not much, but it's a correct minus incorrect scoring. The percentage is correct, roughly in the order of 0.7, 0.8. So that's a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 as average score. But because the test is always covering the whole domain of medicine, it can also be broken down. And what you see here are all the disciplines which belong to the so-called behavioral sciences, psychology, sociology, etc. What you typically see is that they start already quite high, but there is a trend of leveling off in the final 2 years, which specifically at that time were clerkship years, so clinical rotations or clinical attachments. The second one are the clinical sciences, and since it's a problem-based learning system and students start with paper patient cases right from the start, they do increase in their clinical sciences like internal medicine, surgery, neurology, pediatrics, and what have you. And with a bit of goodwill, you might find a bit of an upslope in the more clinical years. The thing I always find. Sorry? Okay. Okay. What I find most interesting are the basic sciences, so the anatomy, physiology, etc. They tend to increase even in the clinical years, even in the years when students do not study anatomy anymore. And there is no other incentive to study the basic sciences than the progress test. And this is really a test-driven effect, a learning gain due to the way of testing. I'll skip these two because for time reasons. And I wanted to highlight a couple of lessons that we learned. Does the concept work? Yes, it's valid, it's reliable, it influences study behavior, has a positive influence on study behavior. But we don't know whether it has a positive effect on student learning. And that's an important point because in learning is an active constructivist thing. You can't make somebody learn. You can make somebody study, but you can't actually force them to learn something. And testing is normally only used to drive student behavior. And of course, it leads to cramming behavior. But we want that test to lead to actual learning. The feedback source is rich. We could do away with resits, and I could spend another half hour explaining why resits are horrible types of examinations in an assessment program and need to be avoided at any point. It's quite insensitive to curriculum changes, and like I said, nowadays it's a shared test between 5 different curricula, and it has huge research potentials. But you do need a strong central quality control. You can't leave it to the odd teacher. It has to be centralized. And we can only focus at knowledge or application of knowledge. The other thing is that the costs are very overt. Everybody sees how much it costs, and nobody sees how much it costs to run 23 individual discipline-based tests. And it requires a pre-investment. But most importantly, and that's going to be a problem anywhere, is people don't know it, and what they don't know, they typically don't like. So keep it. Another issue is that subsequent tests, like I said, they differ in difficulty, and actually what you want to have good growth curves to really measure learning gain, you want to have equated tests so that you can all put them on the same scale. The collaboration brings different things like finding suitable venues by convincing other partners that they should join when it's not something that they've come up with. It has to match with the regulation and the regulatory structure of the whole assessment program. But most importantly, you have to, in collaboration, you have to think about who owns the items, who owns the data, and specifically who owns the research output. Then the final development, we wanted to influence learning. So instead of having it as a separate test, and you might remember that first slide with knowledge, skills, attitudes, and problem solving, and each having their own test, we wanted to integrate them. So the current system is in one of the programs, a 4-year graduate entry program. One of the systems is that all assessment needs to be reflected on and needs to focus lead to learning goals, which actually have to be attained. So the gain is actually forced by the assessment system, and the progress test feeds into that whole system. The students have to analyze their results, have to analyze the breakdown of the results, have to compare the anatomy of the progress test with the anatomy on any other test, etc., to come up to real learning goals. And therefore, instead of having it as a separate test, we try to blend it in the whole system, and it becomes part of a whole integrated programmatic assessment for learning system, which gives huge effects, by the way. Then finally, there are international collaboratives on progress testing. I'm starting one here in Australia with a couple of medical schools. There is a huge research output, more than 28 international publications. Several PhDs have been performed on the progress test. And there are our annual meetings. Amy, for example, has symposia on progress testing. ANZAP here in Australia has symposia on progress testing. So it's really something that's taking up speed immensely at the moment, where it sort of has been dormant for 30 years. Thank you very much for your attention.